Doing well.
A little groggy.
Still early, huh?
Yeah. Well, not so much from the timing of this, but the work that I'm doing with Statistics Canada. I've been working afternoon shifts, so I start at 2:15 and I finish at 10:15 p.m. And
Wow.
and I'm finding that like doing 8 hours at that time of a day is a strain. The job is already too, but so
Yeah.
anyway.
So at that time of night, are you calling people on the West Coast?
Yeah. So that for them, we're legally allowed to call until 9 p.m.
Okay.
We can call anywhere in the country. So the shift usually starts with us calling the East Coast, and then it kind of as it goes.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's part of the grogginess. I that's what I'm putting it to anyway. So,
Yeah.
are you okay with just jumping right in?
Works for me.
I'll start recording. I assume it works. Just a minute. Oh. Well, I'm going to assume it works. I hit record.
My recording button is flashing red, so.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's good that it does that, right? That it warns. Okay.
Yeah.
So
that warns me that I got to watch what I say.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the only thing I really wanted to say before anything that would be published, is to remind myself and you that this might go on the internet, particularly just to be shared with other transitional ministers, but we need to be mindful of the fact that it might be publicly accessible. And but we learn that skill even just as pastors, right, of telling stories that are somewhat anonymized. So so Doug, welcome to this. This is my first shot at this kind of a conversation, but for a long time I felt that that conversations like this could be helpful not only for both of us, but for others who are even considering this work, or who are doing it and just haven't had quite the experiences the same way. So welcome to my first shot at it. It'll probably take its own shape if I do a couple of them. And you were, not as a derogatory statement, but you were the second person that came to mind, but the first person I approached is really not well enough to do this, and not sharp enough anymore. And so the next one that came to mind right away was you, because as STMs in the denomination will know, we have an annual conference where we tell our stories and tell of our experiences, and we interact with each other about the experiences. So we give each other feedback, and almost all of them are memorable in their own way, but you always seem, like me, to have lots of stuff to tell and there's not enough time. So this is kind of an opportunity to follow up on that, as if we're standing in the hallway and I'm just asking you stuff. But to set some context, when did you become an STM, and how many contracts have you done?
Well, it's been about 10 years now, and that time has gone fast. So my first step into interim ministry was a 3.5, 4-month little stint, got my feet wet. And then my next one was 22 months. And then I had a 30-monther and then a 28-monther. And right now I'm into about 20 months into my current one.
Okay. So several of those are actually longer than what most consider usual. 2 years is usually considered the max. What contributed to that?
Dire situations, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a good demonstration of how it's not like it's not a hard and fast, predictable pattern, right? So what drew you into it? And by the way, I want to challenge you. You used the word interim, right? And we tend to chafe at that as professional STMs because it is different. How do you see it as different from what we normally in the church call interim?
Well, I think in the area of transition, we're going to try to change the DNA of the congregation rather than just get them from point A to point B.
Right.
And I think that's where the challenge comes, and I think that's where the pushback is, because we're messing with the DNA, and it's the DNA that got some of these churches that STMs serve into trouble in the first place. Because quite often, and I'm not in necessarily in all of the ones I've done, but in some cases, this is a perennial problem. It's systemic. It's written into their DNA, and it's happened more than once. And that's why I think it's so important that somebody with some training and some experience can step in and assist them in taking a look at the process that they're using
Right.
that has led to some of the challenges that they're experiencing.
But that's also one of the hardest things about being an STM, right?
It is.
is helping them see. So I assume that by DNA, you simply mean the culture of the congregation.
Right.
That's another way of saying it.
Well, yeah, the culture, but the way they do things, the way they come to decision making, the structure, all those kinds of things are part of their DNA.
Yeah. And I know from our recent conference that we had that a kind of a new theme started arising, or certainly I was just becoming aware of it in the last contract I had, and you were talking about it as well. And so as part of that, how decisions are made, thinking back to all your contracts, what common elements do you see as being problematic DNA, I'll say?
Well, I think the church was diminished some decades ago when we decided we should be more business-like.
Okay.
And adapt and adopt business principles for how we do church. And I've even had some people say, well, how come we're not using Robert's Rules of Order? Because those were designed for the church. No, they weren't designed for the church. So the business model, and I'll be honest, I have not had tons of experience in the business model, but the business model seems to me, we get the best people at the table and we tap into their wisdom and into their experience and into their research, and they come together and they make a decision.
Okay.
In the church, from my perspective, that's detrimental because we get people sharing their own personal opinions, their own personal experience. And in the church, in those churches, God is just simply left out of the loop.
Okay.
And what, in my estimation, we need to bring back in is more of an Acts 15 principle. And that is, we come together as elders and leaders of the church to discern what God wants us to do. He owns the company, if you will.
Okay.
And therefore, the only person's opinion that matters is his. So how do we figure that out? And I think when you start to challenge churches that it's not about us or our agenda, it's all about God and seeking his will and deciding discerning what he wants and then implementing it, you are talking foreign language to most of the people that have been in leadership in our church.
Okay.
And they push back at that because at the same time, that tends to limit their abilities because they have gotten their agenda passed and their opinions prioritized by other techniques. And now all of a sudden you're saying, no, we're not using those techniques anymore. We're going to do something totally different.
Right.
And so
yeah,
that's foreign to people.
Right.
And my challenge and yours as an STM is to get congregants and churches to understand that if we engage God and God's will in the process, it is freeing, it is liberating, it is an adventure, it is exciting, and things go a lot better.
Okay.
But to get them to that point, to step into something they're not familiar with and have really never seen practiced very often.
Okay. So it's that long gone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It is all those things, the freeing and the exciting, but it also feels riskier.
It's always riskier to follow God.
Yeah. Yeah. But I didn't want to gloss over that aspect of it because, but
Well,
I agree with you.
it's risky and it's threatening because we have no clue where God's going to lead us.
Right. Right. Yeah.
That's scary. Let's be honest.
Yep. And so that needs to be admitted as well. So that's that's a very interesting, that would be like a thesis for a study of, right, how the business model has taken over the running of the church to a degree that discernment of God's will has left the building, possibly.
Yeah, well, it even has impacts who we put up for elder,
Okay,
because
yeah,
we take people that are successful in other aspects of their life or appear to us to meet our definition of
of
successful,
success,
and we put them in leadership positions in the
right,
church.
right,
And they use their same techniques that have brought them success in business in the church.
yeah,
And then when some guy from the outside comes in and says, no, you shouldn't do it that way, you should do it this way, they tend to say, yeah, right.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I've seen, well, I've mostly in the past seen that in agricultural situations where you have the successful farmers in the community become the leadership in the church. And but they already have a struggle in the sense of they're not used to making collaborative decisions either. Often people that are in business have some experience with that, but you get a bunch of independent-minded farmers at the table, and it's a whole different decision-making
Mhm.
process. Um, yeah, okay. So in your work, like all of us have, we refer to it as an STM toolkit, right? The training that we received, possibly books that we've read since the training. Like for me, the language of adaptive and technical change has become hugely a big part of my work as an STM, and I have sermons about that where I turn adaptive change into heart change, which really is part of that discernment direction that I heard you talking about. So, what are some of the tools in the toolkit that you've used almost in every contract that just are like standby go-tos for you?
Well, one of the things that has served me well is my training as a spiritual director and my
Oh,
experience,
okay.
because and my doctoral work is in spiritual formation as well. And I think this is a spiritual reforming of our congregations, of our faith communities. And it's not necessarily individual spiritual formation. It is, as you mentioned, the word corporate, it's corporate spiritual formation. We need to get people to a totally different paradigm of understanding how do we seek and follow God's will.
I like it.
And so it involves a lot of the gifts like listening. So in a typical STM contract that I've had, I go in and for the first 2-3 months, I just invite people in small groups of 7 to 8 to come, and I listen and I ask them open-ended questions. And out of that discernment, I sort of say, so this is, it seems to me, the issues that we need to deal with in this congregation. And I put those out in front of people and
And
I
you can
do
say,
it.
you have told me them.
Yeah. And I do that very transparently. So the entire congregation knows pretty much what everybody has said, even though they don't know who exactly said it. So
Okay.
it's anonymous, but it's out there. So one of the tools would be for me, vulnerability and transparency, because I think we need to learn how to practice that. So I model it.
Right.
And then out of that, I don't step in and try to solve those problems for them. I invite them into a process that they can address those issues with.
Okay.
So therein is the training in discernment. How do we discern what God wants us to do about the Sunday evening? We've had a evening worship service, for example, that has slowly declined. I'm not going to come in and say, this is what I think you ought to do about it.
Right.
I'm going to come in and say, I think you need to have some conversations and some discernment and deal with this issue and deal with it openly and transparently. So, I mean, I had at one time, I had signed the contract to step in, and I had not yet started my service there. And the chair of the council had announced to the congregation that when the STM comes, he will solve the women in office problem for us.
Yeah, no pressure.
Nothing like setting the bar high.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so I'm not going to solve the problem, but I will give you a process that you can step into and you can walk through that process. So the first 3 months, 4 months, I had a sermon series of about 18 to 20 messages on how do we discern God's will together.
Okay.
And then out of that, we had a transition team that I work with. We came up with a process for how we're going to deal with the women in office issue.
Okay.
Now, this congregation had battled that issue for 8, 9, 10 years. Okay. They had opened it up, closed it, that sort of thing.
Oh boy.
And they couldn't come to a conclusion. And so we came up with this process that was bathed in prayer, bathed in conversations, bathed in small groups, and a process that was then approved by the council and was shared with the congregation. This is what we're going to do. And it was a 4.5-month process. The month of January was spent in prayer. The month of February was spent inviting people in to say, what does the scripture say about these passages? So this passage can be understood this way, and it can be understood that way, those sort of things. So that was the month of February. The month of March, we got together in small groups and asked people in groups of 7 to 8, what are you hearing God say? You've been praying about this. What are you hearing God say that we should do at this church? And then in April, we invited those people to spend some more time in prayer and then to write out I think it was a 3x5 card, either that or a 4x6 card, so that they wouldn't write tomes and tomes of stuff, but ask the question, what are you hearing from God about this particular issue? And then we put all of those in a booklet and passed those out to everybody in the congregation. So everybody in the congregation got to see what everybody else in the congregation had said. No names, but
Yeah.
all the information was there. And then we gave that booklet to the council, to the elders, and said, now you discern the discernment.
Okay.
And
The authority is with them. Yeah. So that's
with them. But I use the picture with discernment that God gives. It's like a puzzle we want to put together, and God gives each one of us 1 or 2 or 3 pieces. And when we put those together collectively, even though every piece isn't in the puzzle, we can see a pretty good picture of what the direction is.
right.
So we all ought to be praying, and we all ought to be sharing what we're hearing from God and put that into the mix, if you will, into the bowl. And then we can see what a fairly clear, not a perfect picture, but a fairly clear picture of the direction God is heading. And all through that process, I'm praying, may it be clear, may it be clear. And
Yeah.
it was interesting that the discernment was, and again, I'm not pushing any agenda or any end result, but the discernment was to open up all the offices,
Okay.
but to open them up slowly. So the first year would be the office of deacon. The second year, pastoral elders would be open. The third year, administrative elders would be open. And then the pulpit, the office of pastor would be open. And that was the discernment. That's what people in the congregation were hearing. And it was overwhelming.
Huh.
And even there were some elders in the discernment process that said, I'm not on that page. That's not where I'm at, but
Okay.
it seems to me the Lord has spoken here. It's
Mhm.
fairly clear.
Well, that's mature.
And that's consensus.
Yeah.
Not everybody has to say, I agree with the result, but they can all say, we believe God is speaking.
So as you're talking, all kinds of questions are coming.
Sure.
So let me first repeat what I'm hearing and then see if I can articulate the question. So I'm hearing that in the way you, at least this particular thing, but from what I know of you, having kind of a defined process is important.
It is.
And the preaching element is very important to you in terms of what you do with the congregation, because you have to
preaching, teaching. You have to teach them because they have never seen it modeled before.
Right. So they have to start to understand it, and they have to start to see it in action.
Yep.
So those are just important pieces in terms of how you do your work as an STM. How is this particular process you just gave? How is it not a vote?
Well, I will push back on that concept of voting. Okay, I mean, you hit one of my hot buttons there. The issue with voting is there are always winners and losers.
Okay.
And I think that's something we want to try to avoid, especially in the church.
Okay.
And so the issue of discernment and seeking consensus is, so we have this group of elders, going back to this previous illustration, and there are, let's say, I think 9 elders around the table. Not everyone agrees. And if we took a vote, it might come down to something like 6-3. Now we're going to share with the congregation, it was 6-3. In my estimation, it's much better if we can affirm what we're hearing from the congregation and from the Spirit's leading in this. And even though we don't personally agree with the end result decision, we're pretty much convinced that this is the direction the church, God is leading the church.
Right.
And so I still have in most of my congregations, even toward the end, people that still want to vote. They want people to name where they're at. And I've been in heard of congregations that have had votes, for example, on critical issues, and it's been like 8-7.
Okay.
And you know, and those have been of such weighty matters as anything I've heard from women in office, yes or no, to whether the pastor should stay or whether we're going to go with an Article 17. So
Right.
rather weighty issues, and it's by basically one vote changing this way or that way makes a huge implication. And in the process of discernment, everybody's discernment, everybody's what they're hearing from God is of equal value. And sometimes, even if there was a 7-1 vote, I would want to hear what that one person says, because they might have some helpful insight that would change the entire perspective and outview and direction of the church. So it's not a win-lose. We want a win-win. We're talking about Christ's church. We're talking about God's kingdom. We're talking about things of significant value to us. We need to get this right.
Okay.
We just can't jump into a vote. The downside of this is it takes more time.
Yeah.
This engages the slow work of God. And it is interesting to me how so many people want to just get it done. Doesn't matter whether it's a good decision or not a good decision. It's a done decision, so it's a good decision. And it's like, that's why we're in this mess. We don't think things through. We don't discern. We don't look at the big picture. We don't involve the people who are going to be impacted by the decision.
Yeah.
We never listen to them. And yeah.
We just kind of toss them aside. Yeah. Yeah. Again, all kinds of, but I'm in danger of moving into the political, but so I will say it. And by the way, for those that ever watch this, if anybody ever does, I'm speaking from a Canadian perspective, and Doug is in the US. But I've had situations where it's pretty clear that political idea of democracy is another piece that has taken over the church in the way they make decisions. So not just this business model, but then that the church is a democracy. I first ran into it in a church where the elders would report back to the elders meeting as if they were senators, right? And so they were representing their constituency, and this is what our constituency says. But of course, those voices tend to have been the complaining voices, because they also had a pattern of, when they did their visits to people, of asking, do you have anything that's troubling you? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get it. So I think I would agree that that's the idea of democracy and then making kind of a quick decision is another kind of corruption of how the church is intended to work. So good stuff.
Yeah, we all represent a constituency of one.
Okay, that's a good way. Yeah. And that's what I said to those elders back then too, is that no, you represent Christ to your constituency, and that's how it works. It flows in that direction. Yeah, I like that, constituency of one. What are some of the tools you give people in terms of, like, if they're not used to this at all, learning how to do discernment? You said, and I had not known this about you, about your spiritual direction angle. I think I was fooled by. I tend to expect spiritual directors to not be as clear speaking as I experience you. So it's like, you know, they do more of this. That's my impression. So it's interesting to learn that that's part of your background. So how do you begin to equip?
Sorry to mess with your paradigm.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, that's what we do as STMs, and we do it to each other too, right?
Yeah.
So, so yeah, what is some of the stuff you do to start equipping the congregation to understand it, and maybe what some Bible passages do you go to, that kind of thing?
Well, again, there's that series I preach at the beginning of the of any STM contract that I've had, and that basically says two things. One is there is a process of discernment, but before that, we have to equip ourselves to be able to hear God's voice.
Okay.
So we initially talk about things like, how do I listen in prayer? Most of our prayer, for example, is, yeah, we just talk. You know, we have our grocery list and we give it to God and we expect him to follow. We don't know how to listen to God. So that's something we got to talk about. We're not people of the word. We're not in the text. We say we are, you know, in our Reformed tradition, but the truth is most of us are not engaged in the word on a daily basis. We don't know how to read the scripture. We don't know how to listen to scripture. So we got to go back, in my estimation, what I'll call back to basics, to the basic spiritual disciplines. How do we run our life? How do we relate to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? So that's involved. The other thing I do in that series is I set it up that unity is an uncompromisable dynamic in the church. It's all about unity. Christ in his, you know, in John 17, it's all about unity. And
Okay.
what things could possibly happen, or could you conceive of that would destroy unity? That would be of value, that you would want to do that over unity.
Okay.
And then when that's the foundation, and we start living our life in tune to God, now we can listen to him. And then this is how we listen together. So first is the building the bricks, my own personal spiritual life
Okay.
with Jesus. And then we start putting the bricks together for how do we do this corporately. And then, and at the same time, I'm going to start giving them models. So I start with the staff. We're going to start doing staff corporately. We're going to start doing staff discerningly. So the decisions, we take the silos. A lot of churches have silos. So they have the youth ministry over here and the children's ministry over here, and they have the adult ministry over here and the worship ministries over here, and they never talk to each other. So we put out a faith formation guide in the church I'm currently at every week based on the previous Sunday's message and theme. And all of those people come together. So we have one guide that has things for children, things for students, things for adults. And then we invite people to do this around their table at night. We invite them to do it in youth ministry. We invite any meeting that's coming together to spend some time with this guide, 15 or 20 minutes at the beginning of their meeting. So now we're all getting together on the same page. I want to model this corporate discernment concept, doing this together. And then we do some church-wide discernment. So, you know, I mentioned the women in office issue. So when I got to that church, that was right on the front burner. That they wanted to do this,
Right.
and they had tried other techniques before, so they were open to trying the process I shared. And then through the process, they say, "This works.
Okay.
I don't understand how this works, but this works."
Ah.
They had lost families. The church I'm thinking about had lost families on both sides of the issue because the church couldn't decide.
Okay.
They'd lost in the neighborhood of 30, 40 families over a course of a number of years.
Yeah.
So we went through this process, and then the decision came out from the leadership, and over the next year, only 3 people walked away because of the issue, or 3 families. So they considered that a huge victory, and it's like, so this kind of this listening to God stuff, this really works. And it's
Yeah.
like, reminds me of Acts 12, where they pray and Peter's at the door, and it's like, so we're doing what we're supposed to do, and you know what? I never dawned on me, it actually works.
Oh, it
And
happens. Yeah.
so then you know, the church that I'm at currently, we're in the middle of this pandemic, and so we have these big political and emotional decisions about what do we do about worship? Should we come together, and how do we come together, and all those kind of things. And we went sort of like this for a while, and then I said, why don't we put a discernment team together?
Okay.
Well, the discernment team came together. They called They invited the congregation to pray, and then they called everybody in the congregation and said, what are you hearing from God? Did the same process, wrote it down, shared it with the entire congregation, so you know we're not pulling a fast one on you, so you can open this little booklet or whatever, and you can see what you said right in there, so you know
It was there, yeah.
validated. And so then when you start to get people that have come through this discernment process, and it can be a big issue or a little issue or whatever, they start to say, this stuff works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then they're more willing to try something, you know, a little stretching, a little bit off the page for them in their area of what's comfortable and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, but you know, it doesn't happen overnight. And even after I've been pushing this in some congregations for a number of years, you're still going to get people say, how come we don't get to vote on that?
Yeah. So in a like if lots of people have learned this discernment process, this is a bit of a risky one, but does it become more obvious when people are actually speaking their own agenda?
Oh, yes. It
Okay,
is
so
so obvious.
that starts to stand out, kind of.
Oh, yes. See, and that for me is that discernment piece. So you get this whole list of what people are listening. This is what I think I'm hearing from God. And
Right.
some people say, I'm not sure, but I think. Some people say, I didn't really get a voice from God. Those are honest.
Yeah.
But then when somebody gives you their own personal opinion, and it's in the middle of all these other people that are really trying to listen to God, it just stands out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so obvious. And so that's where you take that booklet I said with all the comments from people, and you give it to the council, and you say, now you discern.
Right.
And when they look at that booklet, they can fairly clearly tell who is really sharing what they've been praying about and hearing from God, and those that are just articulating their own personal opinion that they've held for the last 20 years.
Okay.
It's
That's
pretty obvious.
significant. That's huge. Yeah. And so it's because sometimes in our work we talk about surfacing things, right? And so it's a rather innocent and good, healthy spiritual way of surfacing things without saying aha, that sort of. So yeah, okay. Part of my brain is running away with that one now, and it might come back with questions later on. I'm going to be a little bit more specific, a slight switch, but in our last conference, a theme that came up often is power dynamics. And so how have you experienced that, again, in a general way? And what tools do you have in your toolbox to surface unhealthy power dynamics, to make them visible to others?
Well, my experience has been when you try to put something like this discernment process into place, you don't have to go searching for the power dynamic. It just shows up.
Okay.
Because what this does is it minimizes those power brokers, because they no longer can say on behalf, this is what the entire congregation believes. I've talked to 20 people and they all agree with me, because we now have all the members of the congregation, we have what they're hearing from God.
Right.
So it diffuses that. And the other thing it does is it frustrates them. And therefore you're going to get more dramatic pushback, and they're going to try other techniques that they have tried in the past that have assisted them. Talk louder, talk more often, use other techniques that arm twisting, and if you don't do this, then I'm taking my money and I'm leaving, and all those kinds of techniques that have worked for them in the past. And so, yes, you get that pushback, and then the challenge is to get the other people not to make decisions out of fear.
Right.
Well, if these people have threatened, one of the classic illustrations right now, I think, is the masks thing.
Yeah.
And the congregation that I am currently serving has decided that if you're in the church, you will wear a mask, period. Well, there are people that don't like that.
Right.
So they have said, as long as we're required to wear masks, we're not coming to church. So there is this fear in the congregation. What if they don't ever come back?
Yeah,
What if they take their money with them and we can't keep the doors open? So that pushes back on the discernment. So maybe we shouldn't go with the discernment that we had. Maybe we should change that to accommodate those people who could possibly leave.
yeah,
And so those people that I think are doing that, I mean, I don't know anybody that likes to wear masks,
right.
but we're doing it because in doing it, there are some benefits that we can have. We can come to a worship service.
And have
We
it in
can,
the first place.
we
Yeah,
can see other people, even if they're 6 feet or whatever away. And so there are some benefits to that. It's still, if you will, my church, to use that phrase. And yet they want to keep it their church. So they're concerned about those other people, and their heart says, I want those people to be worshiping with me. So should we compromise the discernment that we have had in order to compromise, allow for those people to join us? You're going to continue to get that. I don't know what the issue is. You're still going to get that kind of
yeah, yeah.
thing. And
Because
yeah,
that's a sort of a DNA thing as well. That's just a
yeah.
natural fear, and they need to be equipped to deal with that.
But see, what I guess I'm saying is, I don't have to go hunting for that.
It shows up. Yeah,
It
like
just shows up,
yeah,
okay? And it shows up in such a form that observers who didn't see it before can far more easily see it now,
okay,
which
yes,
makes it easier for the STM, in my estimation,
right,
because I don't have to say they're dysfunctional. That process is dysfunctional. They see it's dysfunctional.
right,
Now the question simply is, so what are we going to do about it?
right. So, but a couple things come to mind. I mean, the STM needs to know that it will show up and what it is when it shows up, right? And then needs to be able to not be as affected by it as other people, because your people will
You have
be
to have a non-anxious presence.
right. Yeah, I know. I'm not good at that one. I can freeze for a little bit, but the anxiety then comes out in pacing later on. So
Yep.
so
Well, and we all come pre-fired, so what's the worst that can happen?
well,
So
and that's one of the things I want to get to, but I have a couple others bouncing around here. So the thing is about like people not coming to church because they don't want to wear masks. That could be simply a responsible choice. It's not by nature a manipulation, but it can be done manipulatively as well, right? And so that's what seems to be showing up in some of the stories that I hear of churches. The other thing I wanted to get back to in the terms of the power dynamics, and where my point was, where you need to know that it's going to show up, and like I can get to a point where I go, that's what's going on, right? But to in a couple of my contracts, it's already happened, and I fell into it, and I didn't know what was going on. And so I had one situation where the main power broker in the congregation was sabotaging any kind of progress that we made in a way that they probably didn't even know themselves, right? And I didn't recognize it until I was out of there, so to speak. And so I'm just saying there are ways it can show up at times where you don't really understand what's going on.
well, I think the difficulty with power brokers is, as you mentioned, sometimes they don't know that they're doing it.
Yeah,
But these are people, for the most part, that love their church,
right.
and they don't know any different. And this is the way that they have learned. This is the way that has worked for them.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden there's this outside guy coming in who wants to change everything. I mean,
Or at least that's how they experience what you're doing,
it is.
right? The way I approach it, I tend to ask a lot of questions, and so then people start talking about things they've never talked about. Why are we doing this? And what I've learned is that I've learned to understand how threatening that is for some people when it's just natural for me, right?
Mhm.
So that's interesting.
But see,
So
that's why the whole discernment process minimizes their influence.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. And they will push back at that, but in my estimation, that's okay. I have on some occasions really early thought, well, maybe the best thing is to sit them down and to tell them.
reason with them. Yeah, yeah.
It's never worked really well for me.
Uh-uh.
Um, and I think if the other approach, the discernment approach, the everybody, let's do this together as a body of Christ. Let's do this together corporately. Let's do this together slowly. Those are the kinds of things that minimize their one or two or three people's influence in
Right.
a decision-making process.
Yeah, I like it. I want to go back to the pre-fired, because that's a standard line for us when we're all together, right? But what is the difference there? Like you pastored in a long-term called capacity as well. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the blessing of being pre-fired compared to being long-term. Because even already in this conversation, you've said things that you probably would not have said if I was talking to you as a called pastor in a church, right? So what's that difference? And then along with it, I'll just say, instead of making it a question to you, but I mean, I'm the longer I do this, the more I'm convinced that regular pastors need to be trained in some of this as well, so that every pastor is to a certain degree in STM. I mean, there are those that are pastors that are, that shine in pastoral care, and they shouldn't be doing this kind of thing maybe. But so tell me about that difference, how you see it.
My spiritual director some years ago shared with me an illustration that has been impactful to me. And what I see as an STM is I can hold things loosely like this.
Yeah.
Now, if you ever try, you can hold your hands like this for a fair amount of time without becoming tired. When I was a settled pastor, I was holding things like this.
Okay.
Now you try to hold things very tightly like that, and you become tired very, very quickly. It gets sore.
Yeah.
And when I'm a settled pastor, um, when I was first in ministry, I live in a parsonage, and I got kids, and I got a wife, and I got to take care of them. So I'm a lot less risky. I'm a lot less vulnerable, and I'm a lot more protective of the church. It becomes much more enmeshed in me because that's me.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that the church is going well now, because I'm assuming I'm going to be there in 2 years, and I'm going to have to live with this decision that's made now in 2 years. So I'm much more active. I'm much more engaged in the process. I'll even say I'm much more controlling and manipulative about the process, because I want it to go in a way that is going to be helpful to me in 2 or 4 or 6 years from
Right.
now.
Right.
And as an STM, I can walk in and I can say some things that otherwise I wouldn't say.
Yeah.
Here's a problem. We need to address the problem. You need to address the problem. And you need to know how to address the problem, because you know what? There's going to be other problems that are going to come up, and you're going to have to address those as well. So let's talk about a process that will get us there. And I'm much less interested or passionate about the end result,
Right.
because
Okay.
I will say to them, a good process almost always lends itself to a good decision. Not guaranteed, but the odds are much better. If I go through a good process, I'll get to a good decision. On the
Okay.
other hand, a bad process almost inevitably ends up in a bad decision. Once in a while, I get lucky, and you hit it right on the nail. But most of the time, a bad process leads to a bad decision. And so I'm all about the process,
Yeah.
because you know what? When I leave, there are going to be other decisions that have to be made. I won't be here. But if you engage a process and you find that process to be helpful, and it brings you to a more God-centered decision, then that's the process you ought to be using for eons.
Yeah. I So it's a part of what you do that I don't, your emphasis that I don't understand, because so I have a built-in reaction to the word process, right? Because I think too rigidly about that, or because I mean, Robert's Rules is a process, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's not a very spiritual one.
No, so you have certain things that you mean when you say process. I mean, if we hadn't had the conversation about the discernment process, I
Right.
wouldn't understand that.
Well, and that's the process I'm talking about. It's a discernment process.
Yeah,
Any decision in a church, as for any decision for a believer, needs to put God in the front and in the center of that decision.
okay.
And when we don't,
Well, it's
then we
automatically a
mess
bad
up.
process.
That's a bad process.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there would be a few words that we could tack on to process that would make that more immediately clear. So like a spiritual God discerning process
Yes,
would be, is what you're talking about.
that's my assumption.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I mean, again, I'm my past brings me to this, and like even one of the power brokers that I dealt with wanted a very detailed process laid out from the day I arrived. Like on this date we are going to have this decided, and on this date, and was very frustrated that I was trying to hold things open. I don't know what's going to appear that we need to talk about. I often, depending on their state, I'll go to pretty extreme things. Let's say 3 months in, we discover that the treasurer has been embezzling from the church for years, or I go to some sexual offenses that a previous pastor had affairs with people. We have to stop everything and deal with that. So I can't tell you what the process is. But on the other hand, there's this people-pleasing part of me that wants to give them something, right? The people that ask for that, and I feel then inadequate in doing my job because I don't have a specific process. So I'm just telling you some of the baggage that comes with it for me.
Well, and I'm suggesting a process like what I mentioned earlier, Acts 15.
Right.
But I can't give you a firm timeline. I don't know how fast God is going to move through this.
Right.
I have no clue. There needs to be so much flexibility in this process, in this journey together. Maybe that's a better word. We go on a journey together, and I don't know the timeline.
Okay. Yeah.
If God's in charge, it's His time.
Right.
And if He shares some of that with us, then we'll know. But if He doesn't,
right.
That's where you get back into this liminal space stuff.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I want to make sure we talk about. We had a brief, I don't even remember when it was, but we had a brief conversation about Susan Beaumont's book. So that it's called Leading When You Don't Know Where You're Going, correct?
Yeah, how to lead when you don't know where you're going.
Yeah, and I'm only partway through it. I'm to the part where she's starting to talk about the soul of an institution. But I remember that you were quite excited about the book. Wished you had wrote it yourself. I think you said, right? Or I could have written it. It's a lot of ideas that I already hold, or something of that nature. And from what I have read so far, I see it as a natural, might even be a God building on like the whole adaptive, technical adaptive, and then the canoeing the mountains. I found that author, Todd Balsinger's latest book, less compelling than Canoeing the Mountains, but Susan's book follows on that just really well. It's like when you're in this adaptive thing where you've said God's going to lead us, or in a church context where God's going to lead us through this, and we have to listen for how that happens. So tell me more about your impressions of the book and what you thought she had bang on. I'll tell you that I'm not fully understanding when she's talking about the soul of an institution. Like I can understand language like DNA or culture, and so I'm going to have to reread that piece. But
yeah. Well, the soul for me, just like our soul, is sort of the essence of everything.
Okay.
It's our identity. It's who we are. And so I think the question is, when trouble comes, well, let's back up for the liminal space thing. She wrote the book before the pandemic.
Yeah, that is so amazing, hey?
And she wrote it from the understanding that we used to know what the church was, and we're not quite sure where it's going, but it's kind of out there without some firm, boxable identity. So what is the church morphing into is sort of so we're in that morphing stage, that liminal space. For me, the spiritual thing about that is we're living in the already but the not yet. We are always, in my estimation, in liminal space. She would say at some point we get to the end of liminal space. I would say, I'm not sure we ever do.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
And that should not be the goal. Okay, to get to the end of liminal space so that we know exactly who we are and we can put our feet down on that, and then we don't ever have to move again.
Right. Not on this earth.
Right. And so so she says, I think the thesis of the book is, how do we deal with being in liminal space? And there are differences when you understand you live in liminal space than when you think everything is solid and definable. And so when we have a problem, we hire an expert to come in and to solve our problem, because this is the issue. Here's the expert. He comes with the solution, and now we have it and we're done.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work in liminal space because it's a moving object, if you will. And experience is helpful, some expertise is helpful, but it's not definitive. It's not the answer. So how do we live in that? And she's saying we need to go back to things like a process of how do we deal with this stuff. So discernment is where she falls. Okay.
Yeah.
We need to know who we are. So there's that soul, there's that identity, there's that essence, and we need to tend to that. The other thing I like about it is she says presence is very important. And so that's the difference for me in a church having some difficulty hiring an outside consultant to come in and to say, this is what you need to do, as opposed to an STM who comes and takes up residence with you for a while. So there's that presence. So you have somebody who you can look at and look up to, who has a non-anxious presence, who says, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
This is not the end of the end. Okay.
Right.
We will be all right. Somebody who loves them and embraces them and cares about them and who they can build some trust with. So that says. The other thing I think she points to is memory is so important. And by memory, she means, remember when we had this problem 20 years ago and God stepped in and this wonderful story to tell about that. And you get that in the scripture, and God keeps coming back and saying, remember, remember, because we forget. And so we need to be reminded, in that memory, especially when you're in liminal space and you're on a journey, is so important. And so I like the fact that she says that's important. And I think, again, that resonates with doing STM work. I mean, this is a classic book for STM ministry, as far as I'm concerned.
But for anybody in ministry,
for anybody. But then one of the other four legs, if you will, is the whole idea of purpose. What are we here for?
Okay.
The why. Okay. And we need to know why, and we need to be able to put our stand on that why, because that doesn't change.
Okay.
Everything around us might be changing, but the purpose for why we are who we are doesn't change.
Okay.
And then the last thing she does in the book is she says you have to have a sense of hope.
Yes.
That we're not going to be in this mess forever. And I think the whole church is built around that hope.
Yeah.
So it just resonates with me as a book that
I hear it almost like I said, it sort of builds on the Canoeing the Mountains adaptive technical, because the technical has proven to not be effective. That's the bringing in the expert who tells you what to fix, because there's no ownership and the soul doesn't really change. But I mean, I heard some echoes of Rick Warren in there too, right? Purpose-driven church. And so it may well be that it's an effective pulling together of some of those back threads for us. I just saw, where are we? I think it was on Monday, I watched a video conversation with Rick Warren by Carey Nieuwhof. He's a Canadian pastor that has a video podcast. And it was just interesting to watch, but also how Rick Warren, with his success as many would measure it, in that video, first of all, it was interesting because you could just hear him reciting sermon summaries one after the other. Because he has that pithy way of four, blah, 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 blah. And but one of the most profound things for me was, the most profound was that he believes there's a tsunami of grief coming once we lift out of this COVID. And that's that just made sense to me. I've already seen signs of it, not in the anxiety over wearing masks, but over when the realization comes that society will not return to something we've had before. For me, there's elements of that I celebrate. I never was a fan of handshakes, so if they're gone forever, that's fine with me, But he said, one of the things he said was, they have had their best year ever at Saddleback in terms of new believers, and they haven't had a single worship service. And so he leverages that like an STM would and says, why have we put so much value on that when, in a sense, you could say God or the pandemic taking that opportunity away has actually created a new opportunity that he has blessed, right? As an STM, I just love that, exactly that kind of like, and for the kind of the top guy to be saying it would be even more significant.
Yep.
So yeah, you recommend Susan's book that way, and it does take us back to, as pastors, being in soul care rather than fixers. I'm still curious. I'm jumping a little bit now because now I'm trying to pick up scraps because I talked about doing about an hour, right? Maybe an hour and a half, but I think we've done a pretty loaded conversation that it's okay to start wrapping it up. But what was the topic of your thesis then? In your you said you have a doctorate in spiritual direction?
Spiritual formation.
Oh, tell me about it. We'll do that as the last thing. Well,
I did it through Fuller.
Okay.
And at the time I'd had some experience and was leading a youth ministry. I was involved in the denominational youth ministry of the CRC. So we called it the Young Calvinist Federation, or we called it Youth Unlimited. And so I was deeply involved in that. So it's on, my thesis is titled Spiritual Formation Through Youth Ministry. And it seemed to me that, part of this comes from my own personal experience. I got to be a high school senior and started meeting with a couple of people on Sunday afternoon. There were probably a handful of us. And we started saying, what is it about this Christianity stuff? Now, understand, I went to church twice every Sunday. I was born and raised in the Christian Reformed Church. So we were twicers. So that whole thing, but it was like, what is this really all about? And I went to a Christian day school, and out of that group, and some of this dates me, but out of that group started to grow because other fellow students were also starting to ask similar questions. What is it that makes this really go in the world? And that group grew from, we met for a couple of months with a handful or maybe, but we grew to, by the end of that school year, to over 250 people meeting on a Sunday afternoon to worship. And we would invite other pastors in, and it was sort of a Q&A. We would ask questions. They would give a little short meditation or whatever. But out of that came my conviction that how is it that I got to be 17, 18 years of age in a Christian family, in a Christian church, in a Christian school, and for some reason, the essence of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus never got into my soul, okay?
Yeah.
And that became for me the heart of going into ministry. All of a sudden, this call just came compelling on my life to say, that's the challenge, Doug.
Okay.
And that, for me, is the spiritual formation challenge. How we can go through all the outside issues of going to church and attending a school and doing all that, but if the heart isn't being formed, if the life isn't being changed, then something's missing.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? How do we not only get kids into an attractive ministry that attracts lots of kids to come and go through some motions, but how do we get kids to be transformed into the image of Jesus Christ? How do we get kids to give their life to Jesus and to want to follow him as disciples? How do we get to that? So that was the thesis of my, how do we get it to be more than just motions that we go through and get it into the,
yes.
into
Well,
the
you
essence.
were on that early.
Yeah.
Like I only realized it a couple of years ago. And it actually came out of realizing that I was giving certain illustrations in my preaching out of resentment for exactly that. Like how come the church lied to me, right? Or kept this from me? When in my 30s, when I started having spiritual experiences that in fact the church had warned me against, sort of, like the Pentecostals do this kind of stuff, right? And then to find out that these things were actually legitimate from scripture, and so a couple of years ago, I think it was someone's feedback after a sermon, like, there was some anger in there, Pete, what's that all about? And then, yeah, right, I'm still pissed off. Right? And so I'm glad for you that you were on that early and starting to think about it and starting to get reshaped by that thinking, because there again, I think we're on to a huge challenge in the church. You called it going through the motions, I think. I have a really weird thing where I get way too upset over empty ritual. And some of my stories, you've heard some of them, but when I run into a situation as an STM where I ask, why are you doing this? And nobody knows. And it felt like if it was in a worship service, it felt like the most significant thing to the congregation in that worship service, and nobody knows. That is just baffling to me, right? So now I lean too heavily maybe on that every ritual act must have known meaning, but I've become a bit of a Nazi about that. But that's sometimes how we swing the pendulum from what we had before, right? So that is just so interesting. Doug, I thank you very much for this. It's turned out exactly like I hoped. I had no idea, right? But I knew well that I had no doubt that you and I could have a good conversation. And probably we could have set up another video channel for your wife and my wife to have a conversation on the side, and it would all have been good. But this is part of what I've missed, even with our virtual conferences, is just the chance to even follow up with somebody on something. And yeah, when we're given 20 minutes to tell a year's worth of experience, it doesn't get as full as this. So thank you very much. And I'll check again on record. You're okay with this being put on the YouTube and just see what happens? I see already that it could be hugely valuable for a lot of people. So I like that.
Good. Well, it's just two guys sharing their heart.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah. And trying to stay calm, or at least on my part.
That non-anxious presence.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day, Doug.
Good. Thanks, Pete.
Bye-bye.